Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the NextGen Marin podcast, Priced Out. I'm here with CEO of the Marin Economic Forum, Mike Blakeley. Mike, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you. So before we dive in, could you briefly explain your background, how you became involved with Marin Economic Forum, and what are some of the big projects that your organization is working on right now?
Yeah. Well, how I got involved is a great story I think that your listeners would appreciate, because I like to tell everybody that I am a Marin native. I did grow up here. Like a lot of folks, I went away for school and then went away to work, and worked in different cities in the U.S., different countries, actually. And when my wife and I had kids, we decided we wanted to settle down somewhere and put some roots, and Marin County was the top of our list. And so I am one of those stories of somebody who grew up here, went away, but was able to come back. However, my journey in coming back was not as easy as maybe just conventionally deciding to come back here and purchase a home. We had to rent for a year first and take a look around, and we were eventually able to do it. So this, of course, is an issue today that a lot of young Marinites and parents are worried about. I'm proof that it can be done, but I'm also sympathetic to that it's not easy to do.
Right.
That's on the personal side. Now, professionally, I've had a couple of different careers, but I would say for the last 15 years, I've been in international economic development, and I was working for a strategy consulting firm, and we were actually advising countries on economic growth policies. So when I took this role at the Marin Economic Forum, it was quite a departure, going from working at the country level to the county level. However, from a functional perspective, a lot of what we do at MEF is what I was doing in the past, which is working with elected officials and policymakers, working on private sector strategies for growth, creating public-private dialogues. All of that is something that needs to happen here in Marin. So I was lucky to bring that sort of global best practices into my role here in Marin and try to make some difference in here.
And just out of curiosity, have you found that working with international governments has been easier or more difficult than working with local policymakers here in Marin?
Great question. I actually was working pretty exclusively in developing countries, and the politics in those countries is crazy. And so the interests of elected officials in those countries are quite different than if you look at a place in Marin. So it's definitely more difficult. The one thing I'd like to say, in the very short time I've been in this role here in Marin and been involved in the community here, I have seen the democratic process work itself out in its purest form, in which ways that I never really saw it took place in other countries, including advanced economies in Europe and in Asia in some cases. So that's been really refreshing to come here to Marin and to see, even though politics can be contentious here, it's working the way it's supposed to work, and that does not happen in other countries.
Okay, so that's very good to know. So I wanted to then talk a little bit about some of the broader trends we're seeing in the world, in the U.S., and then I want to get your input on how you think potentially some of those trends are affecting some of the local economic activity we see in Marin. Just to provide a little backdrop, obviously the topic of discussion has been the trade wars between the U.S. and China, and now there's another rising threat of a potential EU-U.S. trade war based on auto tariffs. There have been growing fears of a potential recession. Now, the extent of which of it having an effect on the U.S. and how big it could possibly be is still unknown. But it seems like the big growing fear now that's dominating headlines is how much of a global slowdown is coming and to what extent. One of the things I wanted to ask is, do you think, or have you seen, or has Marin Economic Forum seen anything about how these themes that we've seen in regards to slower growth, adjustment of Fed monetary policy, have you seen that affect anything in Marin's economic activity?
Yeah, we haven't seen anything very directly, and that's because Marin has a very diversified economy, right? We don't have one particular sector that dominates here that could be affected by global markets. So we don't manufacture automobiles or something like that. We don't have many export markets for the goods that we do produce here. And so the global level where we maybe have seen more evidence of it is actually with China and the tariffs that were applied to different goods. So consumer goods and also construction materials have gone up in price for everybody, right? Not just Marin, but that certainly has some impact on the cost to Marin residents in terms of what they're purchasing. In terms of businesses that generally we've been making investments overseas, that's all, and there are some companies like that here in Marin, that has maybe slowed their pace of doing business investment that way, which maybe that's had a an effect on their growth here in Marin. Maybe not. We don't really have good evidence of that.
Okay.
But in a way, our economy mirrors the national economy. So this morning, the jobs report, very robust, 196,000 jobs added, which surpassed what people were expecting. The unemployment rate's at 3.8%, which is historical low. Here in Marin, we're a whole point lower than that. So there's some things that we are mirroring on the national level, but we have not found evidence of one particular sector or business in Marin that is acutely affected by what's happening at the global level.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, because and it's very interesting looking at the data because while we've seen that we've had recent economic data come out of the U.S. that's been very good. However, for the past few months, we've been finding, as a result of, let's say, the government shutdown or just overall slower global growth and reduced exports because of the trade wars, that U.S. economic performance, despite these small little blips, has actually been lagging. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming months if Marin's economy is affected by that. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was potentially the increased construction costs. I was sort of hoping if you could maybe walk through, and maybe you and I could have a little talk about this, about how and why housing starts data and mortgage applications are such an important economic indicator to watch, and what's the economic spillover effect of housing construction?
Well, so you can answer that question in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
right? You can try to be quantitative about it and try to measure some of the impact. And I think we did some of that last year. I mean, what we've looked at in terms of housing starts or construction is really the opportunity cost of not pursuing it, right?
Right.
So whether it's not pursued because costs are prohibitive, and we do know there's evidence that here in Marin, the cost to build, especially to build affordable housing, it's really tough to pencil out.
Yeah.
Right. We know that for a fact.
Absolutely.
So if construction material costs, as I just cited, are going up, that just further compounds the issue. And the problem there is, regardless of whatever policy you have on the book that may allow for building or more building, a developer still has to be able to make money at the end of the day. And so this has been a huge issue, as you guys know, here in Marin. I think that's the best way that I can answer that question is that there are other factors beyond just the simple cost of construction that are influencing, maybe why it's not. I don't know what housing starts are on the national level. Do you guys track that very closely? Are they up, down?
So broadly speaking, I think they've been mixed, but tilting toward the downside, I believe. But the reason why we look at housing starts and it's so important in terms of economic activity is because when you, let's say, take out a mortgage and you buy a house, all of the subsequent spending that occurs is really stimulative to the local and national economy because you have to buy a couch, you have to buy a refrigerator, you have to buy all these things to fill your home. Now, if you just do that with one person, obviously that's not much growth. But if you iterate that across millions and millions of Americans in a given month, in a given year, that aggregate effect provides not only a national stimulus, but a local one. So I think that's also, too, why we've been watching housing starts and why housing we think is so important is because it has tremendous economic effects at the national and local level.
Absolutely. I mean, I would also, suggest that here in Marin County specifically, even if one can obtain a mortgage and somehow make it, we know that they're paying a disproportionate amount of their income to cover the mortgage, right? A higher level than traditional. And what that does is take away their ability to buy other goods and services, right? So I agree with you 100%. The spillover effects of an expensive mortgage like people here have here in Marin adversely affects the economy and lack of consumer spending on the couches and the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the younger demographic too, if they're spending a higher portion of their income on rent, it leaves less room for saving and disposable income, which hurts local businesses and local economic activity, which is actually one of the next questions I wanted to ask you, which is how do you think the private sector is doing in Marin? And is there a trend of business coming into Marin or is it leaving?
Yeah. So let me start with the first question of how we see the private sector doing. The private sector is doing pretty well, like the national economy. As I said, there are some sectors, the ag sectors maybe under a little bit of pressure. I think retail broadly is under pressure, not just because of e-commerce, but just because storefronts in Marin have been having challenges as of late. Maybe because traffic to the downtown isn't as strong as it has. So we see all kinds of evidence of these different reasons why retail might be struggling. But that's one sector that's not doing so well, right? But overall, things are going pretty well. Now, employers across the board are having some very similar challenges, right? And it starts with personnel. So as we know, we're in a very tight labor market. And the first thing when we talk to employers about what their challenges are is they start talking about attracting and retaining employees, right? Now, what's interesting about that is that that's somewhat cyclical, right? We're in a strong economy right now with a very low unemployment rate, and it would be hard to find workers regardless of whether there are other issues like housing challenges, right? So employers in general are going to need to find a way to sort of deal with those effects of this tight labor market, because in the short term, even if you were to build more housing, affordable housing, workforce housing, whatever approach you take, it's not going to satisfy the urgent needs that employers in Marin have. So from that perspective, things are a little bit challenging for them.
Interesting. Okay. And while we're talking about a tight labor market, I was going to ask about like the current workforce. And we know that low and middle income workers are now fleeing Marin, and this is in large part due to the high cost of living. And we've seen some of the externalities that resulted from that, such as greater traffic and greater traffic time and commuters. And we actually have an article on that on NextGen Marin that we published that was actually very popular, outlining how a shortage of housing affects traffic and such. But could you talk a little bit more about the workforce?
Sure. Well, workforce is a huge topic, actually, not just in Marin, but when you start talking about workforce development, that's a really big theme, and it impacts not only just the economic development side of things, but you're also talking about social services, education sector, and all of those sectors here in Marin are working very hard towards creating a better and bigger workforce. But that is certainly the biggest challenge that you have with. Well, there are several challenges with Marin's workforce, and let me just kind of try to go through them. The first one that we observe is having the abundance of low-skilled workers to fill that very high demand right now. And this is directly an effect of part of what you mentioned, the inability to find housing here and have that type of labor force. The second thing is that from a skills perspective, we did recently some focus groups with a technology sector group and a hospitality sector group. And we asked them very directly, what are the challenges that you are having in hiring? And among the many things that came out of that was experience, right? So it wasn't this issue of we can't find workers, they're too expensive, this, and this. The number one issue they cited was experience. So that to me means that perhaps the workforce that they need is not being trained in the right way, or it's not available here in Marin. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why that may exist. And again, affordability is certainly one of them. But this cannot continue. It's not sustainable, right? So we have to find ways together as a community to build that workforce for the future. And there's a lot of pressures now on our workforce besides just the cost thing. If you look at our demographics, as you guys have pointed out, and sort of what your whole mission is here, we are lacking in young people that would be filling whether they're low skill or high skill jobs. We are lacking from a simple population number perspective, those folks to secure our workforce in the future. So from a skills perspective, we have to focus on what are the skills our workforce is going to need. That has to be driven by what is the private sector doing, what are the sectors that we feel are the ones that we need to prepare for. And that also relies very much on a very good relationship between the public sector, the private sector, and education. It's kind of like a three-legged stool, if you will, for workforce. So the Marin Economic Forum is actually that's one of our workforce development is one of our two issue areas for this year that we are focusing on, because we think that that's so important for the future of Marin's economy. And we think there's a lot of areas, as I just cited, that really need the attention.
Right, absolutely. And what you brought up in regards to the demographic shift, I think, is very important, and that not a lot of people have seen. One of the things that we talked about in another article written by NextGen Marin authors is we saw how out of all the 9 counties, Marin actually has the lowest number of younger people to older people in regards to the proportion, and the highest median age.
That's right.
Now, why that's important, and correct me if I'm wrong, is people of a younger age bracket, while they tend to make less, they're in a point in their life where they're accumulating more and spending more, and that helps local economic activity, versus their older counterparts, which may make more, but they spend less in proportion to their income. and that, as we've seen, has a spillover effect in regards to local economic activity. Is that something that, or rather, is that something that Marin Economic Forum has been looking at in regards to how the demographic shift is affecting the local economy, the local businesses, and potentially the future of these people living here when housing is so expensive, they don't have enough money, or they're saving at a rate that is not sustainable enough for them to be able to afford to live here?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. I just wrote to this effect in the North Bay Business Journal a couple of weeks ago, citing very similar statistics that you did. You mentioned a lot of things, so I want to try to unpack a few of the things there.
Yeah, please.
Because the demographics of the county are really, kind of the elephant in the room in terms of why everything about our economy, from housing to what businesses are here and the size of those businesses, it all has to do with the decisions our population has made in the past and will have to make in the future. So this is why we think that workforce is important as a future topic, because this economy needs to stay diverse. It needs to stay vibrant, because for future generations, including my children and other people who want to live here, there's got to be something here besides houses and schools, right? We know that. So let me start by looking at the concern that we have at MEF about the aging population. It has several impacts. First and foremost, you are taking a segment of our population that might be working today and might even be able to work for the next few years. But as those numbers increase, as we get there's in all likelihood that the number of workers available will diminish. Whether they're older or not doesn't matter. The fact is there's still plenty of older adults that have skills and that are working, and we need them in our workforce. They're going to slowly be sort of moving out because they won't physically be able to do work. We're also seeing a large section of our population is going to move towards retirement, and who knows what those people will do as they get to that age group as well. So let's just say that part of our workforce is definitely going to be exiting at a faster rate than the workforce is coming in. And this touches on the younger demographic that you talked about. So one of the figures that I saw was that Marin County, only 10% of our population is between the ages of 20 and 34. That is not only lower relative to the rest of the Bay Area, but that's just alarming. This is where my sort of global experience comes in, and I can cite case studies from Japan, from Italy, from Spain, where we know at the macro level, as their populations got older, they suffered very severe economic consequences. So we certainly don't want anything like that to happen in Marin. So we need to find a way to make sure that we can still support this workforce, even though we have an absence of that younger population today, right? So that's just on the demographic side of things. The more important side of things, and this is really where MEF is trying to have some impact, is in looking at what are the sectors that we are supporting right now? What are the sectors that we want to continue supporting in the future? Because not only are they going to be important to provide goods and services to our residents, but they're also going to be important to provide jobs for our residents, right? So we need to pay attention to the sectors that we have here and make sure they're supported in a way that they are going to have a workforce for the future. And that means by allowing those representatives of those sectors to be able to have a feedback mechanism through the education sector, through the public sector, to make sure that those organizations that are also part of this workforce equation that I mentioned, that they have a way to train up and provide resources into the right kind of training that the private sector is going to demand. And we don't see as much of that happening in Marin as we'd like, which is why we're sort of intervening in that area. And we think that, again, from the workforce perspective, we can have a lot of impact there.
Right. Absolutely. And in regards to the workforce perspective, one of the things I wanted to touch on that you earlier mentioned was in regards to how affordability here is becoming a central issue, and particularly because of the young demographics, because people in the younger age bracket don't make as much as their older counterparts, and that's natural because they haven't had as much experience or time to accumulate the skills necessary to demand a higher salary that would allow them to be able to afford the expenses here. And one of the things I want to relate it back to is how it's sometimes difficult here because of some of the regulatory measures that are in place that make it difficult to develop and build housing. I was going to ask, what do you think are the long-term implications of the current arrangement that we have demographically, in terms of the business outlook because of these shifting demographics and the effect it'll have on the labor force? What is the outlook for Marin if we stay on the track that we're on right now?
Well, I think it's a little bit concerning. And again, this is kind of where I'm coming from. I'm trying to raise the awareness in Marin County for our residents that despite some very positive economic indicators, that in the long term, there are some troubling signs, right? But these signs exist in more than just the cost of housing, to be honest with you. I'd like to see the conversation shift a little bit. That's a given. We've known that. Even when I was growing up here, I knew that houses were more expensive relative to other places. So housing affordability is a subject that, of course, MEF has addressed in the recent past. We had one of our consultants, Jesus Guzman, come on your program. He gave some very good information. I really appreciated the conversation you had with him. And so I think that issue is there. The issue is, what else do we need to be worried about in the future besides the housing issue? Because from our perspective right now, that the housing issue, look, it's not going to be solved in the short term, number one. Number two is it's a supply and demand issue. And number three, as you do know, or your listeners should be very aware, that something is coming, right, in terms of the state level. So there's a lot of legislation being crafted right now. The governor has signaled that what gets through the legislature, he'll be ready to sign because he's committed to addressing the issue, right? Mm-hmm. So the housing issue is going to kind of play itself out in a longer term way, not an immediate term way. So all that to say that it's a little bit dangerous to have a doomsday scenario for what the future is going to look like in Marin if you don't just address the affordability issue, because there are other issues that the economy has to deal with. And this is kind of what we're saying. So workforce, I've already cited as one of them. The other thing that I think is really important that doesn't get talked about much is the health of our local businesses. So I already mentioned that we have a very diverse economy, and we're quite lucky relative to other regions in the United States to have the sectors that we have here. So we have biotech. That's amazing. We have creative sector and the arts and culture sector that's very strong. We have agriculture here, right? We don't have a lot of manufacturing, but we have some very high-tech sort of manufacturing going on. And so these businesses are in Marin, and they need to stay in Marin. And we need to make sure that from both a policy and regulatory perspective, but also from a competitiveness perspective, that we're helping our businesses to not only survive, but thrive and grow. A very interesting statistic is that up to 80% of any region's economic growth comes from existing businesses, not by attracting new ones. And Marin County has never been a place that's aggressively gone out and tried to attract business here. And we certainly don't want a manufacturing plant with 3,000 workers here. That's never been in the spirit of Marin to have that type of business here. But we love our local businesses. We love our small businesses that give so much back to the community. But these businesses, as I suggested before, particularly in retail and ag and some other sectors, they do have some issues that they're dealing with now. And so that's why I'd like to see the conversation shift when we talk about Marin's economy. It can't just be in silos of it's housing this and transportation. These things are all interrelated, and the businesses that are having to deal with some of these affordability issues that you're talking about, certainly they'd like to see that resolved, but they also have other issues that can't be forgotten.
Right, of course, and we're not even saying that housing is the sole issue. That it's the only issue, rather, but saying that it is a contributing factor, and that it does have a spillover effect. What we were talking about, how if, let's say, a worker at a coffee shop can no longer live here because the rent is too high, then they have to commute elsewhere. Then they also have to demand a higher wage because of the increased cost of commuting in terms of time and in terms of gas. The owner of the coffee shop then, to cover his new labor costs, then has to raise the cup of coffee in order to still generate a profit. So those are the kinds of effects that we've been seeing with housing, but not just with housing. Obviously, yeah. It has to do with other factors as well.
Absolutely. I think my point is that business is business,
yeah.
Right? And so now businesses are really challenged with the labor part of the equation, right? Whether it's because housing is expensive here in Marin or other dynamics that are causing them, and so they have to adapt, and that's what businesses do. You would appreciate what some of the larger staffing agencies are putting out in terms of sharing best practices that other companies that they supply labor to, tactics that they're having to take to retain and attract employees. And so, there are two ways to deal with an issue, right? A policy issue like housing. You can deal with the root causes, or you can deal with the effects. So businesses, more traditionally, when they're faced with regulatory obstacles that are very difficult to overcome or that perhaps they can't overcome just by themselves or are going to take a long time to overcome, businesses have to find a way to adapt. They may not like it. We hear lots of complaints, and it's legitimate complaints, and it can affect the bottom line. But at the same point in time, businesses always have some kind of challenge that they need to overcome, right? And so, I give businesses a lot of credit for being able to adapt to situations and figure out what they need to do to continue running their business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we understand that businesses always have to adapt to their circumstances and such in order to generate a profit. But one of our goals, too, as an organization, and you mentioned regulatory obstacles that might be an issue. For instance, about what color, for instance, you can paint the outside of your outside of your business, or other issues relating to that about if they wanted to open up, let's say, another cafe, the labyrinth of regulations that they have to walk through and most likely get lost in the cost of is certainly a factor that NextGen Marin wants to continue looking at. Are there a particular key set of policies or regulations that are hindering businesses being able to thrive in this local economy and operate at lower costs, which will also benefit the residents locally?
Yeah. I'm glad you raised that, actually, for 2 points. First of all, I need to give credit to you and your organization for the research that you did on the case study of a Novato business that wanted to expand. It was good analysis, and I think it gets to the heart of what businesses are facing. We've observed that, and for that reason, I'm actually very pleased to say that we're going to be starting this month a county-wide large-scale business retention and expansion project. And the purpose of that project will be to pursue exactly what you are getting at, which is what are these challenges that businesses are having from a regulatory perspective? What are they having from a competitive perspective? And what does that mean in terms of what the county and its supporting organizations in the private sector, like industry groups, chambers of commerce, et cetera, what does it mean to do? What does it mean for action to address those issues? And I think that this effort that we're doing, and we're doing this in partnership with all the chambers of commerce. We're doing it with VenturePad in San Rafael, the Small Business Development Center. We're going to do it with hopefully Malt and AIM, so we get the ag sector in there, the Latino Council. I mean, this is a community-wide business retention expansion effort to tease out what are the major constraints businesses are having, particularly that affects their ability to grow. But then also looking on the competitiveness side, because what I have found in my work in the past, when you're dealing at a country level industry sector-wide basis and you're talking about what is the strategy, you have to pull together a lot of actors. And there may be large-scale companies in that industry that have their own ideas about what needs to be done, but partnership is critical. And so we hope that this business retention and expansion effort is going to put some findings on the table for the public to see and for people to actually gravitate towards and say, this is our issue as well. I know they're having that issue in Southern Marin, or they're having that issue in this sector. Well, that's also our issue. And MEF wants to be a convener, maybe with you guys as well, of how do we bring together partners to address those constraints? And how do we make sure that the businesses have what they need, again, from a regulatory and competitiveness perspective, to survive and thrive?
That's great. And it almost sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost sounds like a community think tank, almost like a coalition of various other actors in the economy coming together to figure out, okay, what policies can we put in place that will benefit us economically and socially? Because you can't, and I'm sure you know this, you can't separate the economics from the social impact that it has, right? Because when we engage in an economy, we're also engaging social relations too. So that does also have a social impact, which leads me to my next question, which is where can people view MEF research and the work that you're currently doing, like the project that you just mentioned? Because I know there's a lot of people that would definitely be very excited about learning more about this and participating even. Yeah.
So the project is about to start. So this is kind of on your podcast here is one of the first pieces of our rollout. I'm giving it to you and your audience to know that this is going to start probably May or June. There's several pieces of that project that need to be put in place before we can really formally roll it out, but you'll hear about it. And we want as many people to be involved in this as possible. visible. I mean, this is not a study that MEF is doing and then we're going to share our findings with everybody. This is a community effort that we're leading so that we can get together all the sectors and as many companies that want to participate and have their voices heard about these issues. And it may be that the issue that sort of rises to the top might be housing. And this will just be one more piece of evidence for elected officials to understand what the private sector is saying about the health of our economy, what needs to be done, right? So, of course, everybody can always go to our website, which is marineconomicforum.org. But we actually, as part of this project, will also be having a whole communications program so that we can make sure that residents have the opportunity to know what we're doing. In fact, I put this to you and your listeners. We are looking for ways to make our work more visible in the public space. And if that means hosting different types of workshops where we're just sharing some of our findings from other work as well, or just facilitating a conversation about these issues like your podcasts do, we're definitely looking for ways to do that. So I encourage anybody who's listening to this to kind of reach out to us and propose something, and we'll be there. We need to do a better job of getting our work out in the public space and getting as much input from the public as well, and we're ready to do that.
That's fantastic. And once again, what I really like about this new program that you're rolling out is that, like you said, it's not just like an isolated think tank putting out a study and then everybody just looking at it saying, okay, great. But it's really a community effort. And I think that's what Marin really needs, because coming about it as a community, like I said earlier, there's a social utility to it, but there's also economic utility to that as well. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I think I think it'll be a very effective way to try to figure out how some of these businesses can overcome some of the obstacles they face and how we can keep the Marin economic activity still very vibrant in the years to come. But I believe that's all the questions we have today. But Mike, thank you so much for coming in. We'd love to have you again sometime to discuss some of the things that we've talked about today, and we will definitely be we'll definitely tweet about and talk about the project that you were just mentioning.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to working together.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.